Although the inventions made by Phineas and Ferb usually take a starring role, there are two sides to every episode. And for nearly every plan or invention that the two brothers have, there's also an Inator made by the not-so-evil Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz. But of all the Doofs Inators, which ones are useful and which ones should have stayed on the drawing board? Hey guys, I'm Brad with WickedBin, and this is Dr. Doofenshmirtz Inators, useless to useful. Much like with our previous video, Phineas and Ferb inventions, Dumb to Brilliant, we're only going to be covering the most notable and memorable of Doof's Inators. Let us know if we missed any that you feel deserve a shout out. As always, we're going to be starting with the most useless Inators and work our way up to the ones that could actually be used to take over the tri-state area. We're going to be starting with the category Flawed and Destructive. These Inators aren't only useless, they're also dangerous and often cause pretty significant harm to Doof. From the first episode, we have the Magnetism Magnifier. This invention is really stupid, even by Doof's standards.
I haven't really worked out all the bugs yet.
According to him, he had wanted to use this invention to halt the Earth's rotation. He first covered the eastern seaboard in tinfoil, and then tried to use his giant magnet to pull it west. Of course, this failed miserably, and Doof got crushed by a giant ball of tinfoil. We felt we had to rank this Inator at the very bottom because not only did it fail miserably, Doof didn't even have a reason why he wanted to stop the Earth's rotation, other than seeing it as an evil thing to do. So not only was it pointless and stupid, but it also made for a painful lesson in magnetics. Next is the Now Who's Blinded by Sandinator. This Inator takes pettiness to a new level, wanting to finally get revenge on Boris, a bully that always kicks sand in his face. Doof creates this giant Inator to give Boris a taste of his own medicine.
Time to kick a little sand.
However, calling it an Inator is pretty generous, as they're just a giant mechanical boot and a giant bucket of sand. Besides that, it would take a lot of sand and money to fill this Inator once, but a gust is able to turn Doof's revenge back around on him when the wind blows sand back into his face. How ironic. It should also be noted that the Inator quickly falls apart, so as sweet as revenge might have seemed, this thing was just pointless all around. If Doof wanted to dump sand onto his old bully's house, he could have just used a dump truck, but hey, live and learn. Following that, we have the crudely named Poopinator. Don't worry, it's not what you think. Once again trying to get revenge on his brother, Doof created this device to implant an image of the target into the brains of a flock of pigeons. Once the birds have their targets, well, we're sure you can all guess what happens next. This is possibly Doof's grossest scheme, although we acknowledge that it would be effective in ruining his brother's day. Unfortunately, that's its only purpose, as the Poopinator can only assign one target at a time. Doof probably couldn't use it to sick pigeons on the entire tri-state area. It's also not very evil. Mostly, it's just gross. With pigeons having fairly simple minds, it's also easy for Perry to turn the device around on Doof, leading to a very messy end for our favorite evil scientist. Lastly, we have the Deflatinator. You can't do much with the Deflatinator besides the obvious.
Deflating all the tires.
Although we're sure it'd be a nuisance to deal with, especially if you just bought new tires, the Deflatinator isn't exactly evil. It could be used in evil ways, though you'd have to be creative about it, but as it stands, Doof's only motive for using it is to force everyone in the tri-state area to come to him if they want something inflated. What keeps this Inator firmly in the flawed and destructive group is how badly it backfires, deflating the blimp that Doof was using to float above Danville. Thing is, as stupid as it may seem in hindsight, using a blimp was Doof's only option, given that a plane would be too fast and staying in his building would limit his range. Maybe if the weapon was more portable, Doof would have a shot at doing something truly noteworthy with it. As it stands though, it's pretty much a failure. The next category is the neat but impractical. These are the Inators that could be useful in the right context, but are pretty worthless in terms of threat or evil intent. First is the Age Accelerator Inator. Fun fact, Doof was originally going to quit being evil over this Inator, using it to pursue his cheese-making passions. Though this stinky Limburger recipe is delicious, the cheese itself takes 58.5 years to age. And like Doof said, who has that kind of time?
But who's got that kind of time?
Although impressive and useful, we had to put the Age Accelerator Inator towards the lower half of our list for just how few uses it actually has. While yes, it'd make being a cheesemaker a lot easier, not many other foods need to be aged. In fact, aging is detrimental to 90% of things and people. This is demonstrated at the end of the episode when Doof accidentally ages himself and is thus too old and tired to be much of a threat. So the Inator is risky to use. While we're sure cheese lovers would appreciate it, we just can't consider it practical enough to put any higher. Next is the Ball Gowninator. Doof wanted to use this device to turn himself into the manliest person in Danville, by comparison, by forcing everyone in the tri-state area to wear dresses. Although we can't exactly call the scheme evil, the Ball Gowninator is an impressive device given that it can create gorgeous dresses out of thin air. We're sure plenty of people would appreciate that, from shops that sell fancy dresses to people who maybe can't afford a nice ball gown. We still have to call it impractical in terms of its evilness, and we will acknowledge that it isn't something that could be used daily since ball gowns aren't necessarily daily attire, but we still think it's a pretty neat gadget.
The Ball Gowninator.
Of course, we couldn't forget about Norm the Robot. Norm was originally created to destroy Perry, while also symbolizing how mankind is the biggest threat to the platypus species.
The enemy of the platypus is man.
After the scheme fails, Norm actually sticks around, becoming Doof's assistant. Though he runs on squirrel power and tends to make mistakes, Norm is useful in his assistant role. He's helpful, strong, has numerous abilities, and is almost always in a chipper mood, though he can occasionally be sassy. And he can still be a threat, given that he once almost destroyed the tri-state area while Doof was out on jury duty. With all of his abilities and how useful he is as an assistant, Norm could be helpful in certain circumstances. However, we have to admit that you wouldn't really need a giant robot man often. That, combined with all the maintenance that would need to be done to keep him and his abilities running smoothly, causes Norm to still qualify as impractical. Finishing up the somewhat impractical Inators, we have the Chicken Replacinator. If we're being honest, this is a very, very silly invention. Replacing things? That has some merit, but replacing these things or people with the nearest chicken? You have to wonder how that would ever be useful. According to Doof, the Inator was meant to replace his brother Roger's second straight Mayor of the Year award with a chicken the moment he receives it.
My goody two-shoes brother's getting an award.
This will in turn make everyone laugh at Roger because of how inherently funny chickens are. You gotta love the pettiness. The Inator can also later replace things with the farthest chicken, in case you ever needed that option. But while this Inator would be impractical in day-to-day life, we felt we had to give it a mention as well as a decent ranking, given that it's what saves the day twice in Candace Against the Universe. Next, we have the category Somewhat Threatening. We're now moving into the Inators that actually have a chance of doing something evil or being useful for a scheme. Starting this category is the Yodel Inator. Who doesn't like a good yodel? With this special cowboy hat, Doof was able to improve his singing voice.
Yodel, 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 obey me.
He had the crowd under his control with his hit single, Yodel Odel Obey Me. And honestly, we can't blame the crowd for wanting to obey him. What can we say? It's a catchy song. Had it not been for Perry's interference, Doof probably would have had an easy time gaining a fan base that he can then turn into his army or into his servants. After all, we all know how passionate music stands can get about their favorite singers. What keeps this Inator from going any higher, however, is how easily it was taken out of commission, with Agent P only needing to knock it off Doof's head in order to reveal to the audience how much of a fake he was. Had Doof prepared better, maybe the scheme could have lasted longer. As it stands, it just barely makes it into the upper half of our list. We're putting the termite controlling helmet next. There are lots of things out there that are made out of wood, and termites can be a nightmare for any homeowner. So when Doof was able to temporarily control an army of termites with his helmet, it definitely bumped up his threat level. We should mention that Doof only wanted to get rid of all the wood in Danville, so he can then make a fortune off selling aluminum siding.
Then everyone will have to buy aluminum siding from me.
That's not evil, though it is a decent business strategy. Still, the helmet is impressive in just how well it's able to control the termites, giving them plenty of guidance and direction. The only not so great thing about the helmet is the reversal function, which causes the termites to attack Doof instead of obeying him. We're not sure why Doof would install this function in the first place, but hey, it's Doof, so we're not all that surprised. Next is the Invisinator. We're sure that most people have wished to have the power of invisibility at some point, but while this Inator grants that power, it does it in a fairly malicious way. When cupcake selling season for the Fireside Girls comes around, Doof decides that instead of feeling guilty for trying to ignore the Fireside Girls whenever they come around to sell their treats, he's going to turn them invisible invisible, so he doesn't have to look at them.
I'm just gonna shoot them with a ray so I don't have to look at them.
Of course, someone who isn't as oblivious as Doof could use this for much more nefarious purposes. Additionally, for some people, the threat of forever being invisible is major. What brings this threat down is that the invisibility isn't permanent, and that getting hit by the Invisinator again will make you visible. But in an ironic way, this makes the machine more useful in that it gets rid of a potential downside, which will make it easier for a villain to use it for their own gain. Not that Doof seems to notice, he just wants to avoid shelling out cash for fireside cupcakes. But we can appreciate it for its potential. The Inator also has a disintegration mode, which definitely bumps up its threat level. Next is the holiday-ruining Naughty Inator. For kids who celebrate Christmas, a machine that can stop Santa from delivering presents can be threatening. Additionally, it isn't often that a villain is able to succeed in ruining a holiday, albeit temporarily.
I don't hate Christmas!
In this case, Doof made it seem like the entire population of the Tri-State area had been naughty. An impressive feat, making this Inator noteworthy. While it is evil and threatening, this Inator wouldn't be able to do much outside of the holiday season. We learn later on in the episode that it had been Santa who created the blueprints for the Inator as part of his own scheme to grant Doof's, as well as Phineas and Ferb's, Christmas wishes. That alone brings it down, and that it was never ruining anything. It was all part of Santa's plan. Still, the idea of the Inator itself has its merit, and Doof was still able to use it effectively. So, credit where it's due. We had to give a mention to the Make Up Your Mind Inator. This one is simple. After being annoyed by people who can't make up their mind, Doof made an Inator to hone in on these people and destroy them. Destroying people for a minor flaw? That's messed up.
Ferb and I can't seem to make up our minds.
However, we can't say much about this Inator because it's never activated. Once Perry realizes that this Inator directly threatens Phineas and Ferb, he takes Doof out almost immediately, and the two spend the rest of the episode trying to free themselves from their any flat surface magnet belts. However, with the surprisingly dark intentions and implications that this Inator has, we felt that we couldn't really leave it off the list, even if we never see it in action. In our final category, we have the useful and totally evil. Not only could these Inators win the day for evil, but they also have a dark side. We're starting this category with a Devolishinator, not to be confused with a De-Evolutionator. So we've already touched on a couple of Doof's mind-controlling Inators. In case it wasn't obvious, he really wants to be in control. But we feel that the Devolishinator is the best and most successful example. With this helmet, Doof controlled Perry completely. Usually Perry's able to find some way out of being controlled. In this instance, however, he acts as Doof's accomplice throughout most of the episode. Doof forced him to steal a shopping cart, slap himself, and skip down the street, much to the platypus's annoyance.
Why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself?
Although Doof doesn't use the Devolishinator to its fullest potential, being more focused on picking up his daughter Vanessa for a party, in competent hands, this Inator can be useful and evil. Speaking of hands, this Inator also leads to an awesome and memorable moment for Doof later on, when Perry uses it to help Doof with DJing. We had to give it extra points for that. Up next, we have Shrinkspheria. We all have those little annoyances in our lives that we wish could go away. With this Inator, Doof is able to do just that. He explains that all he has to do is enter the name of something he hates, and Shrinkspheria hones in on its molecular structure, shrinking it into a teeny tiny speck so small he never has to see it again. It's unclear what the range of Shrinkspheria is, but even if it only shrinks things within the Tri-State area, it could still cause damage. Imagine what would happen if this fell into more evil hands.
So goodbye to you, Perry the Platypus.
Since it could shrink anything, everyone would be in danger. We don't see a reverse button, so it's unclear if the things that are shrunk can be unshrunk. Thankfully, this Inator isn't all-powerful. Messing with its antenna can cause it to fail, and it can still be blown up. For this reason, we can't put it up any higher. Next is the Platyproliferator Inator. We all know the evil clone trope, but Doof takes it to another level. With the Platyproliferator Inator, he creates several clones of Perry and has them commit crimes all over Danville to frame the agent and get him out of the way. These crimes include stealing money, running from police officers, and littering. Doof also uses these clones to fight Perry, hoping to outmatch him once and for all. As he says, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire.
By fire, I mean Perry the Platypus.
Thankfully, Perry sucks all the clones back into the Inator, blowing it up. You have to wonder though, could Doof possibly recreate this Inator and make evil clones of other people? It'd certainly be an effective evil plan. In a list of evil intentions, a turn everything evil Inator is going to rank fairly high. When Doof realizes how much more useful to him Perry would be as an ally, he uses a turn everything evil Inator to turn Perry evil. This Inator goes beyond the standard mind control or hypnosis Inator, in that it completely changes the personality of the person it hits, turning them evil in an instant. As such, it's likely harder to fight off than some Inator or music-induced trance. Additionally, it turns previously not sentient things into evil sentient creatures, like with the gelatin monster that it creates. Honestly, any other villain would have a lot of uses for this, just as long as they had good aim. Next is the Deluvinator Satellite. This one is memorable. Doof has never been lucky when it comes to romance, and in this episode, he nearly takes out his frustrations on the entire world.
We'll eliminate the feeling of love!
As Doof explains, his Deluvinator satellite eliminates the feeling of love throughout the entire tri-state area with just a push of a button. Even Perry seems concerned about this invention. He may be able to fight off a lot of things, but he can't stop a huge city-spanning beam from a satellite. Although Doof never uses it, finally finding love with a woman who enjoys evil, we still see the effects of the satellite when it crashes and hits his date. Just as Doof promised, the woman is left without any feelings of love, stating that she feels nothing. We're not sure how this Inator could be used to take over the tri-state area per se, but with how harsh and evil it is, we feel that doesn't matter. As far as we're concerned, the implications and effectiveness earn it a high spot. Finishing off our list, we have the Repulsinator. It could be argued that this Inator was Doof's most successful evil Inator, even if it was also the most insulting. Doof created this device to turn anyone who shot with it repulsive. As it turns out, repulsive equates to a mindless zombified Doofenshmirtz.
You freaks!
It's harsh, but Doof takes this insult in stride, and soon enough, all of Danville is taken over by these zombie Doofs. It only needs to be fired once, and once someone is repulsive, they only need to touch someone to make them repulsive too. Several characters get transformed, and at one point, the Doof zombies shut down the water, phone, and power lines in Danville, making it reminiscent of a zombie horror movie. Eventually, Doof gets annoyed with their mindlessness and decides that this Inator was too successful, and that more than one Doof is just too much. So he helps Phineas, Ferb, and the gang come up with a cure for the Repulsinator's effects. Had it not been for this decision, Doof might have ruled an entire world filled with only himself. Not exactly a pleasant thought. Alright guys, that's the list. But let us know in the comments section if you agree with our ranking, and tell us what we should cover next. Remember to hit that notification bell and binge our Dumb to Brilliant playlist, where we figure out which characters have the most wits. But most importantly, stay wicked.